The Forbidden City had almost 10,000 rooms. Versailles had only 2,300. Yet, the smaller palace may have housed more people. That doesn't make much sense. Because if Versailles supported one of Europe's largest royal courts, why did China's imperial palace need 4 times as much space? The answer has less to do with luxury and more to do with what these palaces were actually built to do. But before we go any further, we need to clear up a common misunderstanding. When people say the Forbidden City has 9,000 rooms, the word room doesn't quite mean what most people imagine. Traditional Chinese architecture measures space differently. Instead of counting enclosed rooms, it often counts the spaces between structural columns. Take the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the largest building in the entire complex. Historical records describe it as 11 bays wide and 5 bays deep. That sounds like dozens of rooms. But when you step inside, you discover something very different. It's essentially one enormous hall. So when Chinese architecture counts a gen, it's often counting structural units rather than enclosed spaces. Versailles, on the other hand, counts actual rooms separated by walls and doors. There are different systems measuring different things. And there's another twist. The famous number itself is probably more legend than reality. A modern survey completed in 2012 counted roughly 9,371 gen, not the famous 9,999.5 that appears in popular stories. But honestly, that's not the interesting part. Because whether we call them 9,000 bays, 9,000 spaces, or something else entirely, the larger fact remains the same. The Forbidden City contains more than 90 courtyards and over 1,000 buildings. Its spaces are divided, layered, and fragmented on a scale that Versailles never was. And that's the real mystery. Why? The most obvious answer is because emperors were extravagant. And at first glance, that sounds reasonable. When people think of Chinese emperors, they imagine golden thrones, dragon robes, and unimaginable wealth. If anyone could afford thousands of rooms, surely it would be them. But there's a problem. Extravagance wasn't uniquely Chinese. Like their Chinese counterparts, the kings of 17th century France were equally obsessed with expressing power through architecture. Under Louis XIV, Versailles became a monument to royal grandeur, featuring the Hall of Mirrors, vast geometric gardens, and one of the most expensive fountain systems ever built. If we're measuring luxury, Versailles was every bit as ambitious as the Forbidden City. Yet somehow it's never evolved into the same maze of courtyards, gates, and enclosed compounds, and that points towards a much deeper difference. Because Versailles was designed to impress people, the Forbidden City was designed to position them. Look at the Hall of Mirrors, the gardens, the fountains. All of them create pleasure. They delight visitors, encourage people to gather. Now compare that with the most important space in the Forbidden City, the giant plaza in front of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Many visitors arrive there and have the same reaction. It's uncomfortable. It's huge and empty. There's almost nowhere to sit. Very little shade. No fountains. No inviting corners. By modern standards, it would be considered a terrible public space. But that's exactly why it worked. This plaza was designed not for the comfort of the visitor, but rather to project the visibility of the emperor. As you crossed that vast sea of stone, there was nowhere to hide. Nothing distracted you, nothing competed with the throne beyond. The emptiness itself became part of the political experience. It made you feel small, and it made imperial authority feel almost infinite. So the answer can't simply be luxury. Because both palaces were built by rulers with immense wealth, the real difference lies deeper. Maybe the Forbidden City simply housed more people. That seems plausible. By the late Ming Dynasty, the imperial household had grown to an extraordinary size. Some sources suggest the number of eunuchs alone may have reached into the tens of thousands. And when you look at a map of the Forbidden City, it's easy to understand why people make this assumption. The palace can be divided into two broad halves. The southern half was the political center. The northern half was where the emperor and the imperial family lived, which means much of the northern section was residential. There was a palace for the empress, palaces for imperial consorts, palaces for dowager empresses, and eventually an entirely new district known as the Palace of Tranquil Longevity. And that last one is particularly fascinating because it wasn't built for someone who lived there. It was built for a role that didn't exist yet. In the 18th century, the Qianlong Emperor began planning for his retirement. Years before stepping down, he ordered the construction of an entirely new palace complex, a palace for his future self. Think about that for a moment. An enormous collection of halls, courtyards, residences, and gardens, built not for a current need, but for a future title, retired emperor. At first glance, this seemed to support the argument. Maybe the Forbidden City really did need more space. But then, we run into Versailles. When Louis XIV moved his court there, he deliberately drew France's most powerful nobles into the palace. The royal family, aristocrats, servants, guards, officials, attendants, an entire miniature society revolved around the king. For decades, Versailles sustained a population of several thousand people, and during major events, the numbers grew even larger. So while the two courts were different, both ranked among the largest human organizations on Earth at the time. Population alone doesn't explain the difference, which means the answer must lie somewhere else. Maybe the answer is hidden in the political side of the palace. And here, we're getting closer. In fact, this is one of the biggest differences between the Forbidden City and Versailles. Beginning in 1682, Louis XIV formally moved the French court to Versailles. Along with him came many of the kingdom's most important decision-making bodies: finance, foreign affairs, military administration. France's leading ministers now worked in close proximity to the king. In that sense, Versailles was undeniably a political center. But it was not the entire machinery of the French state. Paris still retained many of the kingdom's older institutions: the high courts, the archival system, municipal administration, and a vast network of bureaucratic offices. Versailles was the heart of government, but it was not government in its entirety. The Forbidden City was different. It wasn't just a palace. It was almost a miniature capital city enclosed by walls. Inside were administrative offices, archives, printing workshops, schools, storehouses, gardens and temples, and even manufacturing facilities. If Louis XIV wanted a new piece of furniture, the request would travel into Paris. If the Yongzheng Emperor wanted an enamel snuff bottle, the entire process might happen inside the palace walls. Design, production, inspection, delivery, all within the Forbidden City. So yes, the Forbidden City did perform more functions, but that still doesn't fully explain what we're seeing. Because more functions only explain more buildings. They don't explain more courtyards, more walls, more gates, more layers of separation. At some point, we're no longer talking about function. We're talking about something else, something the walls were designed to control. Put the floor plans of Versailles and the Forbidden City side by side, and one difference becomes impossible to ignore. Versailles feels like one giant building. Hall connects to hall. Gallery connects to gallery. Large groups of people share the same spaces. The Forbidden City feels completely different. A gate, a courtyard, a hall, side buildings. Then the pattern repeats, again and again. The question is, why? The answer is hidden in the walls. Because in the Forbidden City, walls are not background architecture, they are the main actors. Their purpose wasn't simply to divide space, it was to divide status. And even more important than the walls were the gates. To a tourist, a gate is just an entrance. But in the past, a gate was a permission system. Each threshold determined who could pass and who could not. An official sword began at the Meridian Gate and often ended there as well. They could enter the outer court where the affairs of the empire were conducted, but the inner palace remained forbidden to them. The world of an imperial consort was even smaller. Many spent their entire lives moving between just a handful of palace compounds, never once setting foot in the vast courtyard before the Hall of Supreme Harmony. For palace maids, the boundaries were smaller still. To them, the Forbidden City was not a 720,000 square meter palace complex. It was often nothing more than a single courtyard. Eunuchs enjoyed greater freedom of movement. They carried messages and supplies between storehouses, kitchens, offices, and the inner palace. They connected different parts of the palace together, yet they too remained constrained by strict rules. They could move through space, but they could never truly possess it. And in a sense, even the emperor himself was subject to the same logic. Across the Ming and Qing dynasties, all 24 emperors ruled the Forbidden City in name. But many of them never saw every corner of it, not because they lacked access, but because the system itself was designed around separation. One of the most powerful institutions in the Qing Empire was the Grand Council, yet physically it's surprisingly small. Most visitors today walk right past it without even noticing. Unless you know exactly where to look, you could easily mistake it for a row of storage sheds. What made it powerful wasn't the building itself. Its authority came from one thing: proximity to the emperor. The offices sat only about a minute's walk from the Hall of Mental Cultivation where the emperor lived and worked. Because of that, this narrow row of modest rooms became the place where many of the empire's most important decisions were made. Meanwhile, the largest building in the entire complex, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, might only be used a handful of times each year. The same was true of other halls along the central axis, including the Hall of Central Harmony and the Hall of Preserving Harmony. Their purpose wasn't efficiency but ceremony, visibility, performance. The display of power, not the exercise of it. And perhaps that's the most important clue of all. Take the Hall of Union. It wasn't a residence. No one actually lived there. Instead, it functioned as part of the emperor's ceremonial role and housed the imperial seals of state. Its significance came not from the person inside it, but from the office it represented. Or consider the Palace of Tranquil Longevity, which we mentioned earlier. In many ways, it was a miniature Forbidden City hidden inside the Forbidden City itself. It contained its own ceremonial spaces, residential quarters, courtyards, and gates, an almost complete replica of the imperial system. But it was built for someone who did not yet exist, the future retired emperor. Qianlong ordered its construction decades before he planned to abdicate. And then something rather ironic happened. When he finally stepped down, he never moved in. Unable to let go of power, he continued living and governing from the hall of mental cultivation until his death. The palace built for the retired emperor was barely used by one, yet it still stands in the northeastern corner of the Forbidden City today. When you return to Versailles after seeing all of this, something becomes much clearer. The real difference between the Forbidden City and Versailles was never just architecture, it was power. Versailles concentrated power. Its vast halls and galleries pulled people toward the king. Everyone wanted to be seen. In fact, many nobles lived in constant fear that Louis XIV might point at them and say, "That is a man I have never seen before." In a court where royal favor meant everything, being noticed was survival, so the aristocracy spent their lives trying to move closer and closer to the king. The Forbidden City worked in exactly the opposite way. It used courtyards, walls, and gates to separate power. Seeing the emperor was not an expectation, it was a privilege. At Versailles, the closer you stood to the king, the higher your status. In the Forbidden City, every increase in rank required another gate, another wall, another courtyard to pass through, and in the end, what mattered most in the Forbidden City was never the thousands of rooms people like to talk about. It was the boundaries that separated them.